Robert Anderson, a seasoned taxi driver in New York City, had spent the better part of his life navigating the chaotic streets of the city that never sleeps. In his late 50s, with graying hair and deep-set lines marking his weary face, Robert had seen it all. The rush hour madness, the late-night revelers, the tourists lost in translation. He prided himself on being a man of the streets, someone who could read people with a single glance. To Robert, every passenger was a story, but not all were stories he wanted to hear. Over the years, he developed a set of unspoken rules about who was worth his time. He often justified his prejudices as street smarts, a necessary armor against the unpredictability of life behind the wheel. Robert's taxi was an extension of himself, worn but reliable, like the man who drove it. The yellow cab had seen better days, with its faded paint and a few dents that told silent tales of the city's relentless pace. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of coffee and faint tobacco, remnants of Robert's long shifts. The radio, tuned to a talk show station, filled the silence with discussions about politics, sports, and the occasional scandal. It was Robert's window to the world outside his cab, a world he felt increasingly disconnected from as technology and society evolved faster than he cared to keep up with. One evening, after a particularly tough day filled with unruly passengers and endless traffic, Robert received a ping on his taxi app, an upscale pickup request from a fancy address near Wall Street. "Must be some rich guy in a hurry," he muttered to himself, glancing at the address on his phone. Without a second thought, he navigated his way through the bustling city, past towering skyscrapers that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. As he approached the location, his mind was already forming judgments about the type of person he would be picking up. In Robert's world, appearances meant everything, and he often let his assumptions guide his actions, even when he knew deep down they were often wrong. As Robert maneuvered through the busy streets of Lower Manhattan, his cab bounced over the potholes that dotted the city's roads. He pulled up to the sleek, glass-fronted building that housed some of the most powerful financial firms in the world. Robert's eyes flickered to the mirror, surveying the scene around him. Wall Street was a different world, one filled with sharply dressed professionals and luxury cars. To Robert, this part of town represented everything he wasn't: rich, polished, and seemingly untouchable. Waiting at the curb was Michael Johnson, a tall, well-dressed black man in his late 30s. Michael's crisp navy suit was tailored perfectly, his tie meticulously knotted, and a leather briefcase hung casually at his side. His presence exuded confidence and success, the kind that Robert had grown to resent in people. As Robert's cab came to a stop, their eyes met briefly through the car window. Michael's polite smile was met with Robert's cold, appraising stare. Michael opened the back door slightly, ready to step in, but Robert didn't even wait for him to settle. In an instant, his instincts and prejudices flared up. "Sorry, man. My shift's almost over. I can't take you," Robert said curtly, barely glancing up. The excuse was weak, but it was one he had used before when he didn't want to deal with certain passengers. Michael stood there, momentarily taken aback by the sudden rejection. He looked at Robert, confusion clouding his features as he asked, "You sure? I just need to get across town. It won't take long." Robert's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He avoided eye contact, muttering, "Yeah, sorry. Try the next one," before driving off, leaving Michael standing on the sidewalk. As he sped away, Robert felt a sense of twisted satisfaction, convincing himself that he had avoided a potential hassle. He switched the radio back on, drowning out the gnawing feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had made the wrong call. In the rearview mirror, he caught a final glimpse of Michael, still standing at the curb, now raising his arm to flag down another taxi. It was a fleeting moment, but one that Robert quickly pushed aside as he merged back into the relentless flow of city traffic. He didn't know then that this encounter would soon come back to haunt him in ways he could never have anticipated. As Robert drove away, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He kept telling himself that he'd made the right decision, that it was his years of experience on the streets guiding him, not some irrational bias. "I know trouble when I see it," he grumbled under his breath, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. The city outside his window blurred into a series of lights and shapes, But Robert's thoughts were anchored on the man he had just rejected. It wasn't the first time he turned someone away based on a gut feeling. He'd done it with passengers he deemed too drunk, too rowdy, or simply out of place for his liking. Yet, there was a part of him that felt uneasy, though he would never admit it. Michael's rejection was a reflex, not a decision. Robert had built a mental image of who fit into his cab and who didn't, and Michael, despite his polished appearance, had been instantly categorized. The unspoken rule was simple: Robert's cab, Robert's rules. But as he replayed the brief interaction in his head, there was something about Michael's expression, part confusion, part disappointment, that lingered. It was the kind of look that suggested this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, and it wouldn't be the last. Later that evening, as Robert sat alone in his small apartment in Queens, the day's events replayed in his mind. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and sank into his worn-out recliner, staring blankly at the muted TV flickering in front of him. The encounter with Michael wasn't anything unusual in his line of work, but there was something about this particular moment that nagged at him. The silence of his apartment felt heavier than usual, filled with thoughts he didn't want to confront. He tried to brush it off, convincing himself that he was just being cautious, that this was simply another day in the life of a New York City cab driver. Meanwhile, back at the curb, Michael watched Robert's taillights disappear into the traffic. He wasn't unfamiliar with the look that Robert had given him. He had seen it too many times in boardrooms, at restaurants, and now on the streets of the city he called home. A mixture of frustration and resignation washed over him, but he quickly shook it off. Michael was used to overcoming obstacles, and one rude cab driver wasn't going to ruin his night. He eventually hailed another taxi and continued on his way, leaving the incident behind, or so he thought. For Robert, however, the moment wouldn't be so easily forgotten. The next few days passed without incident, but every now and then, as he glanced at his rearview mirror, he saw more than just the traffic behind him. He saw the echoes of his choices, the faces he'd turned away, and the unsettling realization that sometimes his street smarts were nothing more than thinly veiled prejudices. He couldn't know then that his casual rejection of Michael would soon lead to an unexpected reckoning. A week had passed since Robert's encounter with Michael, and life behind the wheel continued as usual, or so it seemed. Robert had settled back into his routine, ferrying passengers from one corner of the city to another. The daily grind of Manhattan's bustling streets offered him the familiar comfort of predictability, even if the traffic jams and demanding passengers often frayed his patience. It was another ordinary morning, and Robert was listening to his usual radio station, a mix of news, talk shows, and traffic updates. As he tuned in, a sudden announcement caught his attention. Breaking news from the city's largest taxi company. "There's been a major change in ownership," the radio host declared. Robert's ears perked up. He recognized the name of the company. It was the very one he worked for, a company that had been a fixture in his life for decades. The new CEO is expected to bring sweeping changes to the organization, including potential new policies that could impact all drivers, the host continued. Robert turned up the volume, suddenly interested. He knew that in the taxi business, change usually meant more rules, more oversight, and less freedom for drivers like him. Rumors quickly spread among the drivers. Robert began hearing whispers through his taxi's radio system, a communication tool used by dispatchers to relay messages to drivers. There was talk of a mandatory meeting scheduled for all employees, something that hadn't happened in years. Robert's colleagues were abuzz with speculation. Some said the new owner was a young hotshot looking to modernize the fleet. Others guessed it might be someone from outside the taxi world entirely. The uncertainty left Robert feeling uneasy. He had always been wary of change, especially when it threatened the fragile sense of control he had over his work life. As Robert pulled into a gas station for a quick break, he chatted with a fellow driver, Sam, a grizzled veteran of the streets like himself. "You hear about the new boss?" Sam asked, leaning against his own cab as he sipped his coffee. Robert nodded, feigning indifference, but his curiosity was undeniable. "Yeah, some bigwig thinks he's going to come in and tell us how to do our jobs. I've been doing this longer than he's been alive." "Probably," Robert scoffed, trying to downplay the unease that was slowly creeping in. "Word is, this new guy's got big plans," Sam said. lowering his voice as if he were sharing classified information. Supposedly, he's all about equality, training, and making things better for everyone. Can you believe that? Like we need someone to tell us how to treat people. Robert snorted, but there was a flicker of anxiety beneath his bravado. The thought of being told what to do, especially by someone who had never driven a cab a day in their life, rubbed him the wrong way. Back in his cab, Robert continued his shift, but the rumors gnawed at him. He wasn't looking forward to a mandatory meeting where he'd be lectured about how to run his own cab. The last thing he wanted was someone breathing down his neck, trying to change the way he worked. Yet, deep down, he knew he had no choice but to show up. As the meeting day loomed closer, Robert's apprehension grew. He didn't yet realize that the new CEO was far more familiar than he could have ever imagined, and that this encounter would force him to confront more than just new policies. The day of the mandatory meeting arrived, and Robert found himself reluctantly making his way to the company's headquarters, a nondescript building tucked away in a bustling part of the city. As he parked his cab among a sea of yellow taxis, he noticed the unusually high turnout. Drivers of all backgrounds, men and women, young and old, were gathering in the large conference room. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and a dash of defiance. Robert walked in, feeling a twinge of unease at the unfamiliar setting. He preferred the noisy streets to sterile conference rooms filled with corporate types who, in his opinion, rarely understood the realities of the job. The room was dimly lit, with rows of folding chairs facing a small stage. A podium stood in the center, flanked by a projector screen displaying the company's logo. Robert took a seat near the back, crossing his arms as he glanced around. The chatter among the drivers was filled with speculation. Some complained about having to waste their morning at a meeting, while others quietly wondered what the new boss had in store. Robert's gaze wandered to the front of the room, where a group of well-dressed executives were huddled together, whispering among themselves. He had no idea who the new CEO was, but he was already annoyed at the thought of being lectured by some corporate type who had probably never even stepped foot in a cab. As the clock struck 10, the room fell silent. A middle-aged man in a suit stepped up to the podium and introduced himself as the company's COO. After a brief introduction, he announced, "And now, please welcome our new CEO, Mr. Michael Johnson." The name echoed in Robert's ears, but it wasn't until Michael stepped onto the stage that Robert's heart sank. There he was, the same man Robert had rejected on Wall Street just days ago. Michael Johnson, dressed impeccably in another tailored suit, stood confidently at the podium. His presence commanded attention, and the room fell silent, save for a few whispers of recognition among the drivers who had picked up on the man's impressive resume. Robert's face went pale, his breath catching in his throat. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The man he had casually dismissed as just another passenger was now the head of the company. Michael began his speech by introducing himself and sharing his background, his rise in the finance world, his commitment to innovation, and his desire to make meaningful changes in the taxi industry. His voice was calm, measured, but with an underlying tone of authority that left no room for doubt. Then, Michael's tone shifted. He began to share a personal story, recounting an incident from the previous week. "Last week, I tried to hail a cab in this city, a city I love and call home," Michael said, his voice resonating with the room. "But the driver, without reason or explanation, refused to take me." Robert's stomach churned as he listened, recognizing every word of the story. Michael continued, his eyes scanning the room, though he didn't point fingers. "It was a moment that reminded me that we still have a long way to go in treating each other with respect and dignity." The room was filled with uncomfortable shuffling. Drivers exchanged nervous glances, while Robert stared at the floor, hoping to disappear into his seat. Michael went on to outline his vision for the company, a place where every passenger would be treated fairly, where drivers would be trained not just to navigate the streets, but to engage with their passengers with respect. He spoke about implementing policies of equality, new training programs, and a shift in company culture. For Robert, it was as if every word was aimed directly at him, an unspoken confrontation that pierced through his defenses. Michael's story hung in the air, a heavy silence settling over the room as the weight of his words sank in. For Robert, it was as though time had slowed. He sat frozen, every muscle tense, as Michael continued to speak. Though Michael never named him directly, Robert knew. He was the driver in the story, the one who had turned away the new CEO without a second thought. It felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. This wasn't just a tale of an unlucky encounter. It was a public indictment of everything Robert had thought was safely hidden behind the anonymity of his job. Michael's voice was steady but carried a personal undertone, a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "I'm not here to point fingers," he said, his gaze sweeping the room but landing on no one in particular. "But this incident reflects a deeper issue that we must address together. It's not just about me. It's about how we treat each other every day on these streets. We have an opportunity to set a standard, not just for our company, but for our entire community." As Michael spoke, Robert's mind raced. Flashes of that day came rushing back. The dismissive wave, the look on Michael's face, and the smug satisfaction Robert had felt as he drove away. Now, the memory felt like a stain he couldn't erase. Michael's story wasn't just an anecdote. It was a mirror held up to Robert's own prejudices, a reflection he could no longer ignore. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling exposed in a way he never had before. Michael continued, outlining the changes he planned to implement. "We're introducing new training programs aimed at fostering respect, understanding, and professional conduct," he announced. "This isn't just about policies. It's about building a culture where every driver feels proud of their work and every passenger feels safe and respected." The words stung, not because of what they proposed, but because Robert knew that these changes were partly a response to his actions. It was a silent but unmistakable message. Things would not continue as they were. Robert glanced around the room, trying to gauge the reactions of his fellow drivers. Some looked attentive, nodding along with Michael's vision, while others appeared indifferent, their expressions betraying nothing. Robert, however, felt something deeper, an uncomfortable mix of guilt, shame, and the bitter realization that his actions had not gone unnoticed. For the first time in his long career, he felt accountable, not just to his passengers, but to the broader sense of humanity that Michael was calling for. Michael's closing words were met with a round of applause, polite but measured, as the drivers digested the implications of what they had just heard. Robert clapped half-heartedly, his mind elsewhere. As Michael stepped down from the podium, he mingled briefly with the other executives before disappearing into the crowd. Robert watched him from a distance. The man who had transformed from a nameless passenger into the embodiment of a lesson Robert hadn't been prepared to learn. When the meeting ended, Robert lingered, feeling the weight of his mistake more acutely than ever. He had come to the meeting expecting nothing more than a lecture, but he left with the profound understanding that change was not just inevitable, it was personal. The encounter with Michael, once a fleeting moment he had dismissed, was now a turning point he couldn't ignore. It was a wake-up call that reverberated far beyond the walls of the conference room, marking the beginning of a transformation Robert never saw coming. The meeting room slowly emptied as drivers shuffled out, some grumbling about the changes, others silently absorbing what they had just heard. Robert lingered at the back, still reeling from the revelation. The incident with Michael was now etched into the fabric of the company's new direction, and Robert couldn't escape the feeling that his actions had played a significant role in shaping what was to come. As he made his way toward the exit, Michael's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of his failure to see beyond his own biases. The following week, a series of official announcements were made, detailing the changes that would soon take effect. An email from the company outlined mandatory training sessions for all drivers, focusing on diversity, respect, and customer service. The tone was clear. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a requirement. Michael's name was prominently featured at the bottom of the message, underscoring his personal commitment to the new policies. For Robert, it felt like a direct order from the man whose trust he had carelessly thrown away. A few days later, a company-wide video call was scheduled. Michael appeared on screen, looking composed and determined. Behind him was a banner displaying the company's new motto, "Driving Change, One Ride at a Time." The message was unmistakable, both a literal and symbolic call to action for everyone involved. Michael spoke with conviction, outlining the necessity for the new measures and emphasizing the company's mission to set a higher standard in the industry. His voice was calm but resolute, leaving no room for doubt that these changes were here to stay. "We've been given a unique opportunity," Michael began, addressing the drivers directly through the camera. "We're not just drivers. We are the face of this city to millions of people. Every interaction matters. Every ride is a chance to make a difference." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I want this company to be a place where every passenger feels welcomed and safe, and where every driver feels valued and respected. But that requires all of us to look inward and confront our own biases." Michael's speech was punctuated with statistics and real-world examples, drawing on both his personal experiences and broader societal issues. He didn't shy away from tough topics, addressing the prejudices that many drivers, knowingly or unknowingly, carried with them. "We all have our blind spots," he continued, his eyes unwavering as he spoke to the camera. "But it's what we do once we recognize them that truly defines us. I'm not asking for perfection. I'm asking for progress." The new policies were laid out: mandatory sensitivity training, regular evaluations, and new passenger feedback systems designed to hold drivers accountable. Michael also introduced a hotline for reporting discriminatory behavior, ensuring that no passenger would feel the sting of rejection based on appearance, race, or any other bias. To many, these measures seemed extreme, but Michael framed them as necessary steps toward building a more inclusive and respectful environment. Robert listened intently, a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration brewing inside him. He didn't like the idea of being forced into training sessions, feeling like a schoolboy being reprimanded. But there was also a part of him that recognized the sincerity in Michael's words, the undeniable truth that his actions had a real impact on the people around him. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Robert knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. As the call ended, Michael left the drivers with a final thought. "We can either be part of the problem or part of the solution. The choice is ours, and it starts now." The screen went black, leaving Robert alone with his thoughts. He realized that the days of coasting on old habits were over. Change was coming, and this time, Robert was right at the heart of it, whether he liked it or not. Robert received the notification about his first mandatory training session with a heavy sigh. The email was straightforward, outlining the date, time, and location. An online webinar with mandatory participation, focusing on diversity, respect, and professional conduct. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had spent his entire career avoiding what he considered pointless lectures was now being forced to confront his own behaviors head-on. Robert felt cornered, stripped of the autonomy he had always valued. Yet, he knew he couldn't ignore the summons. The company was clear. Non-compliance wasn't an option. The training began with a polished presentation led by a facilitator skilled in handling reluctant participants. Robert logged in from his living room, the faint sound of traffic outside providing an unwelcome reminder of the job he was momentarily away from. On screen, the facilitator introduced herself, her voice warm yet firm, and dove into a series of slides filled with statistics, case studies, and real-life scenarios. The content was direct, sometimes uncomfortable, and clearly designed to challenge preconceived notions. Robert watched with crossed arms, a skeptical frown on his face. The session covered everything from unconscious bias to the history of discrimination in customer service industries. As the facilitator spoke about real-world consequences of biased behavior, Robert couldn't help but think back to his encounter with Michael. The examples felt eerily familiar, hitting too close to home. There were interactive segments where drivers were asked to reflect on their own experiences and discuss their thoughts in breakout groups. Robert, reluctant to engage, mostly listened, his silence hiding a mind working overtime. One of the exercises asked participants to imagine themselves in the shoes of someone they had rejected or treated unfairly. Robert's mind immediately returned to Michael, standing on that curb, his polite smile fading into confusion as Robert drove away. It was a small but searing moment that now felt monumental. Robert's instinct was to shrug it off, but the exercise forced him to sit with the discomfort. He imagined what it would be like to be dismissed without reason, to feel unseen and disrespected in a city that prided itself on its diversity. During a break, Robert took a moment to step away, pacing his kitchen as the session's lessons simmered in his mind. He felt a mix of anger and shame. Anger at the system forcing him into this introspection, and shame for realizing just how blind he had been to his own prejudices. The training wasn't about pointing fingers or shaming the drivers. It was about opening their eyes to the small, everyday moments where they had the power to make a difference. But for Robert, it felt intensely personal, like a direct challenge to his way of thinking. As the session resumed, Robert found himself paying closer attention. The facilitator spoke about the importance of empathy, of seeing every passenger as a person with their own story, their own struggles. Every time you refuse someone a ride, it's more than just a missed fare, she said. It's a missed opportunity to connect, to help, and to show kindness. The words struck a chord with Robert. For the first time, he began to see his job not just as a means to an end, but as a series of choices that reflected his character. By the end of the training, Robert felt drained but oddly lighter, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been partially lifted. The session concluded with a call to action, urging drivers to embrace the changes and commit to treating each passenger with dignity and respect. Robert logged off, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He knew this was just the beginning of a much longer journey, one that would require him to unlearn years of ingrained behaviors. But for the first time, he felt a flicker of willingness to try. A few weeks after the training sessions, Robert was back in his routine, navigating the city streets with a newfound sense of cautious awareness. Though he still grumbled about the changes and rolled his eyes at the constant reminders about respect and equality, something had shifted within him. He was more mindful of his interactions, catching himself before making assumptions about passengers based on their appearance. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. One afternoon, as Robert idled near Central Park, he received another ride request. He accepted it automatically, his mind more focused on the weather forecast than on the details of the pickup. When he pulled up to the location, his heart skipped a beat. Standing on the curb, dressed in his usual sharp attire, was Michael Johnson. Robert's stomach churned with a mix of dread and awkwardness. Michael glanced up from his phone, and their eyes met briefly, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Michael approached the cab with a calm demeanor, opening the door and sliding into the back seat without a hint of hesitation. Robert's mind raced. He couldn't tell if Michael had recognized him from that fateful day on Wall Street, but his composure suggested that if he did, he wasn't going to mention it. As Robert pulled back into traffic, an uncomfortable silence filled the cab, the city's noise outside contrasting sharply with the tension inside. Robert cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "Afternoon. Where to?" he asked, keeping his tone as neutral as possible. Michael glanced at the rearview mirror, meeting Robert's gaze with a composed but unreadable expression. "Downtown, please," Michael replied, his voice smooth, betraying no sign of the history between them. Robert nodded and drove, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he navigated through the crowded streets. After a few minutes of silence, Michael broke the ice, his voice casual but purposeful. "Busy day out there, huh?" Robert nodded, grateful for the small talk that eased some of the tension. "Yeah, traffic's always a mess this time of day," Robert responded, his eyes flicking up to the mirror to catch Michael's expression. There was no trace of hostility or resentment, just a quiet observation of the city rushing by. Michael leaned back, looking out the window at the bustling sidewalks filled with people from all walks of life. After a moment, he spoke again, this time with a touch of introspection. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be in this city," Michael began, his tone reflective. "It's a place that challenges you every day, makes you confront things about yourself that you didn't even know were there." Robert listened intently, feeling as if Michael's words were directed at him, though they were phrased as general musings. He kept his focus on the road, but his mind was fully engaged in the conversation. Michael continued, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had made peace with the complexities of the world. "It's easy to get caught up in the hustle, to judge people by what's on the surface. I've done it myself, more times than I'd like to admit." The admission hung in the air, resonating deeply with Robert. He hesitated, then found his voice. "Yeah, this city. It can get to you, Robert said, his voice tinged with a rare vulnerability. You start seeing people as obstacles instead of, well, people. Michael nodded thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving the window. The important thing is recognizing it and choosing to be better, even if it's just in small ways, Michael replied, his tone gentle yet firm. They continued the rest of the ride in comfortable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. When they reached the destination, Michael paid the fare and, as he stepped out, paused for a moment. He looked at Robert with a faint but sincere smile. Thanks for the ride, Robert. Take care. The use of his name startled Robert, confirming that Michael did indeed remember their first encounter. But there was no animosity in his voice, only a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they were both on. As Robert watched Michael walk away, he felt an unexpected sense of relief. It wasn't a grand confrontation or an overt forgiveness, but it was a moment of connection that spoke volumes. Robert knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path, guided not just by the city's traffic lights but by the subtle, powerful lessons he had learned along the way. As the days passed, Robert found himself reflecting more on his interaction with Michael. It wasn't just the encounter that lingered but the way Michael had approached the moment, with grace, understanding, and a quiet determination that spoke louder than any words of reproach could have. Robert's time in the taxi was now colored by this evolving awareness, a gradual unraveling of the hard shell he had built up over years behind the wheel. Each passenger that stepped into his cab became a new opportunity, not just a fare but a chance to rewrite his narrative, one small act of kindness at a time. One afternoon, Robert picked up an elderly woman struggling with her groceries. He didn't hesitate to help her load the bags into the trunk, a gesture he wouldn't have bothered with in the past. The woman, grateful and a little surprised, chatted with Robert about her family, the neighborhood, and the weather. It was a simple conversation, but Robert found himself genuinely engaged, listening not out of obligation but out of a newfound curiosity about the lives of those around him. Another day, he picked up a young man who appeared lost, both literally and figuratively. The passenger, with a heavy backpack and a nervous energy, asked to be taken to a nearby shelter. Robert could sense the weight of the man's troubles and, instead of just dropping him off, took a moment to offer some kind words and directions to a nearby job center. The man thanked him, visibly moved by the unexpected kindness. Robert watched him walk away, feeling a sense of purpose that went beyond the usual grind of his job. These small moments accumulated, each one a step toward becoming the version of himself that he had glimpsed during the training sessions. Robert wasn't perfect. He still had his rough edges, his bad days, and his occasional lapses in judgment. But he was trying, and that made all the difference. The city, once a backdrop of indifference, now felt like a living, breathing entity full of stories that Robert was slowly learning to see. One evening, as Robert was wrapping up his shift, he found himself parked near the same spot on Wall Street where he had first encountered Michael. The financial district was quieter at this hour, the tall buildings casting long shadows over the empty sidewalks. Robert turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the hum of the city wash over him. He thought back to the man he used to be, the driver who would judge at a glance, who saw his passengers as transactions rather than people. He realized how far he had come and how far he still had to go. Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled through the company emails, stopping on a message from Michael, a company-wide newsletter highlighting the progress made since the new policies had been implemented. The email featured stories of drivers who had embraced the changes, transforming not just their approach to work but their outlook on life. Robert read each story carefully, feeling a sense of camaraderie with the other drivers who were, like him, on their own paths of redemption and growth. As he read, Robert felt a swell of gratitude for the second chances, the difficult lessons, and the people who had unknowingly guided him toward becoming a better man. He knew he would never be perfect, but perfection was no longer the goal. It was about making conscious choices, one ride at a time, to be just a little kinder, a little more patient, and a little more open to the world around him. He looked up at the skyline, the city lights twinkling against the night sky, and allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile. For the first time in a long while, Robert felt hopeful. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, back into the flow of traffic. The road ahead was uncertain, but Robert was ready to navigate it with newfound purpose, one that extended far beyond the confines of his yellow cab. He had learned that sometimes the greatest journey wasn't the miles traveled on the streets, but the changes made within, and that was a journey worth continuing. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's truly heartwarming.